Good morning, gentlemen. As you know, my focus is military theory and strategy. And today I'm going to take up a very interesting topic, which I think you're all going to like it very much. I'm going to discuss whether Napoleon Bonaparte was one of the great generals of military history or not. General Bonaparte, or as we say, Napoleon I, came into power in 1798. He was a general of the French army, and after the French Revolution in 1789, a reign of terror has been let loose in France. And there's a gentleman called Robespierre. He was the chief executor. Napoleon overthrew this and took over power and established what is we call a military dictatorship. I think this is a cardinal period in French history and history of the world when Napoleon seized power in France. Gentlemen, Napoleon was a very ambitious man, and obviously he was not an ordinary individual. That also we should realize. But the fact remains that we have to judge the ability of Napoleon as a general in relation to the great captains of world history like Genghis Khan, Timur, Attila, Alexander the Great, and others. So, what are the hallmarks of a great general? Gentlemen, I will lay out the QRs, and the QRs are ability to leave a lasting victory behind. That's the first and most important thing. It should not be a transitory victory wherein the general wins a few battles and then vanishes, and nobody hears about his contribution. That is one. That is what is the lasting effect of his generalship. That's the first point. The second point, which is very important, is his realization, his appreciation of the strategic scenario around him. Third, whether he achieved his political aims or not, or the political aims of the masters for whom he served. So these are very three important points which are the hallmark of a great general. Gentlemen, we'll have to see whether Napoleon fits into these or no, but there is no denying the fact that Napoleon led the French to some glorious victories, the like of which the French had never seen. But then, astrologically, he had in the 12th house Saturn, that is also called the Napoleonic house, and it shows that one rises to great heights and then has a fall. Well, gentlemen, Napoleon Bonaparte was the most hated man in Europe at one time, but now the French swear by him and they consider him to be one of the great heroes of France. Napoleon Bonaparte, to his credit, I will say that there were seven coalitions ranged against him from the period 1800 to 1815, and he defeated five of them. But he lost the crucial one, the sixth one, and that is where the 12th house of Napoleon comes in. I'm just trying to correlate astrology with what happened. It's not, of course, a gospel truth, it's an interpretation only. But at the same time, we must realize that Napoleon was not an ordinary individual. In the 19th century, when he was fully in power, the British Prime Minister was asked, how are we going to look at the map of Europe? And his answer was, roll up the map. He says, throw it away for the next 10 years because there's only one map, and that is Napoleon. The land army of Napoleon was one of the biggest the world had ever seen. He had almost 1.2 million men under arms. And this is the first time where mass scale warfare came into prominence. Earlier, the battles were fought by a few thousand soldiers, but in this case, Napoleon had more than 1 million men with artillery to support him. He wanted to make the navy equally strong, but he was a little on a weak wicket there. But all the same, the British were able to galvanize the Prussians, the Russians, and the Spaniards against him, and with the result, a number of coalitions came up. Of course, his most famous victory is the Battle of Austerlitz in 1805, when an entire coalition was defeated by him, and that's one of his best battles. What was Napoleon's theory? Napoleon's battle theory was number one, to confuse the enemy, number two, to force the enemy to commit his regular troops early on while keeping his reserves behind, and then attack with an artillery cover and destroy the enemy. Wonderful, but then a commander must be flexible, and I think Napoleon was not flexible. One thing which will go against Napoleon is the 1812 campaign in Russia. Now, this, despite all the victories he won, remains one of the biggest detriments to Napoleon being declared as one of the greatest generals of world history. He amassed an army of almost 600,000 soldiers and they invaded Russia. Russia was always part of the coalition against the French, and Napoleon had thought that once the other East European countries were his vassals, he would make Russia his vassal, so that once he had subdued Russia, he would then take over Great Britain and destroy it. Gentlemen, this campaign has brought out the fallacy of Napoleon as a great soldier, as a great general. He failed to galvanize or to understand the mind of the Russians. The Russians followed something which Napoleon never understood, that is a scorched earth policy. That means the Russians were retreating, and at the same time they would burn everything and leave behind nothing. So when the French army came, they had no food to eat, no supplies, and they were in serious trouble. But during the summer of 1812, the French did move into Russia and they occupied Moscow. When Napoleon entered Moscow, he was thinking that the Tsar will come forward and have negotiations with him like it was in the other cases. When the emperors who were defeated would come and negotiate with Napoleon. But the Tsar left Moscow and went away. The entire city was burnt. There was nothing to eat, and Napoleon had no choice but to order the horses of his army to be eaten after cutting the heads. It was a sad event, a very sad day in the history of the French army. Napoleon had no choice but then to order a retreat. Now, a great general is one who envisages the second part. When you are winning, you must be ready with an alternate plan in case you are defeated. But he had no alternate plan other than just retreat back 1,200 miles back into Europe, back to his hometown. And on the way, they were harassed by the Russians. And when he crossed back into Germany, the French army of 600,000 soldiers had been reduced to 95,000. That means 500,000 men perished in the Russian campaign. Gentlemen, this is a very important campaign, and most of the Western historians gloss over Napoleon's abilities as a soldier and do not give due credence to his Russian campaign, which was a total failure. Then I come down to the fact that after Napoleon had come back to power, after being imprisoned in the islands of Elba, and he ruled for 100 days, there was one crucial battle which was to prove his doom, and that is the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. The commander of this force was the Duke of Wellington, earlier the Duke of Wellesley, who was in India as the commander of the East India Company and had defeated the Marathas and Tipu Sultan. He'd been called back to England and made commander of the British and the Allied forces, the Seventh Coalition, to fight Napoleon. That is the issue which is very, very important. Napoleon should have studied his opponent and the generals who were in charge, and before the battle there was a rain, and he still believed in his tactics of assault. This was the time to sit back and watch the enemy take the offensive, but he launched an assault as he used to always, covering with artillery fire, and then used up his resources. Net result was that when there was a counterattack, the French army couldn't hold because, as it is, they had lost 600,000 men in Russia, and Napoleon surrendered to the British. Now, this point is very sad actually, and Waterloo remains one of the great battles of world history, but there Napoleon was defeated. Now, could Napoleon have won the Waterloo battle? I think he could have if he had allowed his old brain to function. The ground was sodden, there had been rain, and the French army was much smaller than the coalition, so he had to adopt a defensive posture, which he didn't do it. He thought he will seize the initiative and win the battle. Maybe if there was no rain and the ground was not sodden, his cavalry would have carried the day. But things were different. Even when Napoleon walked in the sand, his feet were sinking inside the earth, and he probably at that time realized that he was going to commit a mistake in launching an assault. But he didn't carry out any reappraisal of his plans, and the battle continued, with the result ultimately the French were defeated. He also suffered a defeat in Spain. Now, that part also we must remember. Napoleon had gone and captured Portugal with Spain, who was an ally, but then what he did was he made the king of Spain abdicate and put his brother as the king of Spain, and that was not the proper thing to do. But then there were counterattacks, and finally the French were driven out of Spain. So there was a hodgepodge in the sense Napoleon was left all alone. He had some allies, small people here and there, but entire Europe had ganged up against him. It's something like what's happening now when entire Europe has ganged up against the Russians in the Ukraine war. At that time, Napoleon should have been wise enough and have tried to break the coalition politically. And as I said, the end result of campaign is important. And considering fact that the Napoleonic Wars lasted only 12 years, that is from 1803 to 1815, where he did win some stupendous victories, as I've told you. There were 5 coalitions earlier on which he smashed, one after another, but the crucial ones he failed. Gentlemen, Napoleon, where do I place him as a soldier in the pantheon of great generals of world history, say like Alexander and others? I think Napoleon was a good general, but he was not a great general. He's a good general in the sense he knew how to mobilize a smaller force and bring about results. That's the first thing. Secondly, Napoleon was the first man who brought in the concept of vast and mass movement of armies. And thirdly, Napoleon is the first man who decided that the battle cannot be confined to a small village or city but has to be continental, in the sense a world war. Theoretically, if you look at it, actually the Napoleonic Wars should have been classified as a world war because the French were fighting the British everywhere. They were fighting in America, they were fighting in India, where the British French commander was Dupleix and he was facing Robert Clive. All that is there. But Napoleon could not exert himself totally outside Europe. In fact, in 1809, in the famous Battle of Trafalgar, the naval battle where Lord Nelson led the British fleet, the Spanish French fleet was annihilated, and Napoleon couldn't do anything much about it. But, gentlemen, During those 12 years, Napoleon put entire Europe on notice. He created a dream for the French people and they loved him for it. But all this was to no avail because at crucial moments he committed great blunders. He had no allies practically in Europe, with the main ally that the Prussians, Russians, and the British against him, including the Spaniards. So he was hemmed in from all sides. In other words, his diplomacy had failed. Number two, he should have tried to break the coalition. I don't think he made any attempt, and more or less he antagonized most of his opponents who could have joined him also, like the King of Spain. Well, gentlemen, Napoleon was, in my opinion, a good soldier, a man with some vision, but certainly not a captain to be put across amongst the great generals of world history. Napoleon had no permanence in whatever he did, his campaigns, and after he went away in 1815 and was imprisoned in the island of St. Helena in the Atlantic, General Napoleon became just a name in world history. Later on, the French brought his remains back to Europe and buried him there, and they started thinking about the glory of the French Revolution and Napoleon. But at that time, there was significant opposition in France against Napoleon. And you will realize that 1812, when Napoleon was away in Moscow, there was a military coup in France, in Paris, to oust Napoleon. And Napoleon came to know about it. He came back and took revenge on all the conspirators who were hanged. So, gentlemen, there were so many things which go between wheels. But one thing we must come to the conclusion that Napoleon was a good soldier, but not a great soldier, not the greatest one in world history. And he did make a mark in world history. I think in 1815 he was the most hated man in Europe, but later on French forgave him, and now he's considered as one of the heroes. I personally, if you ask me, I am a great admirer of Napoleon Bonaparte because so many things which we must learn from him, and that is fighting in an adverse climate when everybody is against you, and always being ambitious and always leading from the front. He was not one of those generals who sat at the back and let the armies move forward. He moved with the armies in the front himself. He led the campaign in Russia himself on his horse. They lost. That's another aspect because that was a faulty strategy which he had adopted. Well, gentlemen, I'll close now about General Bonaparte. Certainly one of the most colorful characters of world military history. I give him a lot of space as a soldier, as a general, as a good leader. Maybe he would have been perhaps one of the greats in world history if he had left some permanence behind him. Because once he left, the Allies restored the Bourbon monarchy. Well, that's all part of history. And Napoleon then, dynasty almost ended. But all the same, he was a man who shook Europe. Hats off to him. Though he's certainly not one of the great captains of military history. I close now, gentlemen, and say, Jai Hind, glory to India, look after yourself, do subscribe to my channel, share it with your friends, and come back for more. Goodbye, and God bless.